We thought we would just start with a brief introduction. I'll give a little bit of history behind ESG and where it came from, why is it important, and there's a little more context we'll get into as what is ESG. We typically refer to it as environmental, social, and governance issues, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. But just to start with, the where and the why of ESG. So thinking about how everything developed, it certainly seems like, especially in the past 3 years or so, things have really taken off with ESG. We're hearing a lot more about it, particularly on the regulatory side. But just to give some context, when I think about how it all developed, obviously environmental, social, and governance issues have been around forever. But for me, I think about the real impetus was probably in 2004 when the United Nations put out their Sustainability Development Goals, 17 separate goals, for everything from clean energy, clean water, gender equality, human rights, peace, end hunger, 17 different goals. And that, I think, set the stage, so to speak, for the ESG movement. And over time, there were a number of other things that got this going. So high profile corporate collapses, Enron, WorldCom, distrust of corporations. We had Sarbanes-Oxley come out of all of that, where a lot of the governance aspects of ESG lie, how's board independence work into it, auditor independence. And then, sustainability kind of became a global trend. It became a fad in a way, or a virtue in a way. And all of that combined with other things like social and civil unrest, Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement. All of that started coming to a head more in the past 3 to 5 years. And you add into that asset managers, institutional investors who started to invest in ESG type funds. So there's a lot of money involved in ESG as well. When you think about money managers, consultants, auditors, consultants, lawyers, and framework developers too, those that create the frameworks for ESG, for different standards for companies to follow. So kind of follow where the money is, but all of that kind of leads up into where did it come from and why is it important? The slide that we have here shows for your company, there's a lot of pressures that you get from a lot of different stakeholders. And all of those stakeholders, they may not all be worried about climate, but some of them are going to be worried about social issues. Your employees are certainly going to worry about that. Some will worry about governance. Your investors will worry about that. Certainly risk management. But there's also your vendors, your suppliers, your customers, and then, of course, the regulators. And they tend to come in sometimes toward the end of things, which we saw with Sarbanes-Oxley, of course. And now we're seeing that too with some of the regulators and some ESG regulations and disclosure obligations that are coming for public companies.
Jen, what I really appreciate the way you frame that is that it can feel like this acronym came out of nowhere, but it is kind of a steady oral history of it building. And like any big framework, ESG, it's 3 letters. It encapsulates everything, which also can mean it's extremely amorphous and it's extremely dynamic for what it means for you as a company. So, there's a lot that sits underneath that broad umbrella, and not just substantively what are the issues, but to your point, Jen, the different stakeholders that might have a point of view or perspective on how you are taking these things into consideration. It's very idiosyncratic in that regard. Even 2 companies that are identical in structure, they might have different share structure, right? They might have different stakeholders in that regard, or they might have different boards. And so what's going to be most relevant for them is going to look different. And so Betty, it's great to have you here virtually with us. I think in particular because you've kind of shepherded a strategy within a company about thinking from, okay, how do we start putting a structure around ESG? It would just be interesting to hear from your side, what were some of those original stakeholders or drivers for you all at Lennox when you were starting to think about how do you build a strategy around ESG?
So thank you. It's great to be here with both of you. As you both said, this is something that's gone on for a long time. Employees have wanted to work for companies that do good things. We want a good reputation in the public. But one thing that really came to light for Lennox was we make heating and air conditioning and refrigeration equipment. And we started looking around at our peers, and they were very far advanced, or much further advanced in their ESG story than we were. So while we've been doing a lot of great things, we weren't really telling the story, and we weren't sharing all the things that we'd been doing. So, we started with thinking about low-hanging fruit, but that we could share with an eye toward our investors. So that was really the lens that we started with, because we didn't want to be someone overlooked for institutional investors if when they wanted to add it's HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, an HVAC company to their portfolio.
Go to the Encompass. No, 2 slides back. There you go. Yeah.
There we go.
So, just again, setting us on the same page. ESG can encompass a range of risks and opportunities not historically considered. And so, typically, from the perspective that Betty's speaking to, the investor angle, what can be really helpful as a starting point is really saying, okay, well, what are the potential material ESG factors? Let's not start with everything that might be relevant for all stakeholders, but maybe let's take a subset and focus first on what are the drivers for us from a material consideration. So just high level environmental, the E in the ESG generally deals with resource usage. So that's management of different resources that you might use in operating your business or within your value chain. It's also relevant from a climate perspective, increasingly, as Jen mentioned, the regulation and the regulatory efforts around that is going to become even more critical once that rule is final for publicly traded companies, but then also private companies that are dealing with companies that have to comply with that rule. On the social side, it broadly is understood to be both social, so societal issues, how you're interacting, maybe your license to operate in certain communities, or your human capital, so your individuals that make up your company. How are you looking at that from a resource standpoint? And then on the governance side, leadership and governance matters that pertain to either ethics or compliance, the kind of framework. So it's not, in many ways, the ESG itself is not defined solely as really clear pillars. It's a broad framework, and these issues do interact with each other, which can also introduce an element of confusion or dynamism that might exist, where environmental issues do interact with governance and social issues do interact with environmental issues, which can add kind of another element of really making sure when you're thinking about this for your company that you're really prioritizing what the issues are that either your stakeholders are concerned with or that might be perceived as having a material impact on your financial performance.
And I think it's a really good point to consider, like, what is it that's important for your company, or what is it that you're particularly good about within these different buckets that you want to talk about and you want to draw attention to. And I think most people think about ESG and they automatically go to climate change, right? That's been it certainly is a big part of it, but that certainly is not all of it at all. There's other aspects as well, as Killian mentioned, on the social side. And social doesn't just mean, racial equity or gender equity. It means health and safety too. During COVID, what were we doing to protect our workers? What do we do generally if we're a manufacturing company, right? How do we engage with our workers to ensure that their health and safety is controlled? Because that's important from a regulatory standpoint as well. And on the governance side, we've already talked a bit about it, Sarbanes-Oxley, right? That's something where people, investors, employees are worried about your governance of your corporation and what your board is doing, where the oversight is, what are the risks, and how are you dealing with them? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot bigger, and it's amorphous, but it's a lot bigger than just the E in ESG.
Yeah, and one of the things that we saw, Georgetown, we specialize in helping companies understand the expectations of the investors. And so for a lot of companies, there was what felt like a really dramatic and quick shift, if you're a public, from 2019 to 2022, where institutional investors were really starting to integrate environmental and social considerations into their pre-existing governance focus. And so that did lead to what felt like a divergent view or a gap in perspective between large institutional managers and the companies that were making up their portfolio. And that dynamic is shifting still. Every year, there's a little bit of a revision in terms of how these institutional managers are understanding how they feel like companies need to be prioritizing the issues that they deem to be most important. And so that can be a really critical component to just remember, regardless on if you're public or you're private, as you're developing out this framework for yourself, it's dynamic. It's not a static component. It's not you set it and you forget it and you move on. It's adapting and changing continuously.
You see that with Larry Fink too,
Yeah,
right? The
exactly.
CEO of BlackRock. He has his annual letter to CEOs, and that's changing every year too. He's been doing that for 10 years. And it always addresses something different. So
Well, and I think what you look at too when you're just in the company is the environment changes, not the environment in the E as far as greenhouse gas, but the environment changes for employees. I mean, we used to have in our risk profile, ensuring that we got high quality talent, to fill our jobs. Well, we need to make sure during COVID that we had enough employees just in our factory for our factory to operate. So, and as the demographics shift in the United States and around the world, we need to make sure that we're looking at the sustainability of the company, just ensuring, workforce issues that we didn't even have to address 3 years ago.
All right. So I said, environment isn't everything. That said, there's been a lot of growth within the E part of ESG, especially in terms of setting up frameworks. And what do we mean by frameworks or standards? Those are things where you've got, along with some mistrust of government, there's been non-governmental organizations that have sprung up to help companies or to hold them accountable, if depending upon how you want to look at it, for reporting on sustainability. So frameworks, there's a number of these out there, and we've got a few listed on the slides. Frameworks are just voluntary frameworks that a company can look to help them determine what metrics they should be reporting on or disclosing to their stakeholders. And these help you walk through various aspects of your business, and sometimes can even help you with a gap analysis too, to figure out maybe where you're lacking some things. So a few just on this slide: GRI's Global Reporting Initiative, that's fairly broad. It actually covers a lot of stakeholder concerns, investors, consumers, government organizations. Those are sort of the stakeholders when you think of GRI. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the frameworks there are very industry focused. So there's, I think, 77 different industries that you can go to, 77 different frameworks for what particular industry you're in. And there, the focus is really on profit delivery. So what is material from a financial perspective to the company? And because it's standardized, it's easier, at least from my perspective, for companies when they follow SASB to be able to produce comparable results that will help you compare your company to another in the same industry. And then TCFD, that's really focused more in on climate. So that's the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. We told you ABCs of ESG, right? There's a lot of them. So this framework really focuses on climate risk and how climate impacts financial information. And what's kind of just an interesting point is TCFD and then GHG protocol, which is greenhouse gas protocol. It's been around for a while. Those are the two, if you're a public company, those are the ones that really have influenced the SEC's proposed climate change rule. So I don't want to spend much more time on this. I think it's a little boring, but just realize if you're starting from scratch, which a lot of companies are, particularly private companies, this is someplace you can look to get your arms around, okay, well, what should I be thinking about? How should I be measuring some of these metrics and disclosing them to investors?
Jen, I think you bring up a good point too, that they're voluntary, but they're informing regulatory trends. So these things in particular, the US context, climate, but then SASB and TCFD are aligning through this another standard process. So the good news is that there's greater consolidation. even involuntary expectations that then are translating into how certain developments in the US and then in Europe are being codified into law. And then Betty, I think you were going to say something, but I think this is a good transition to the next slide too, because I think it really speaks to how Lennox started thinking about your reporting and approach as well.
Yeah, so Georgeson helped us a lot in this. We looked at what our peers were, what frameworks they were reporting against, and then we looked at our large investors to see what frameworks they preferred. And luckily, since GRI takes probably the most work to disclose against, our primary investors were looking at SASB and TCFD. This gave us a great way to get started in our ESG report because we chose two frameworks that aligned with our industry, and it really helped us focus on what was going to be important to investors and what was going to be important to our stakeholders. Some of these that are highlighted are things that were important to us. These are just examples of, obviously, we make air conditioning, so greenhouse gas emissions, and we make furnaces. That's a big thing for us. But that way we could talk, we knew it gave us a roadmap on what to talk about and what to make sure that we included narration in for our report. So at the back of the report, we've got the SASB framework and what our specific answers are on the various disclosing items. But then in the body of the report, we can go into more detail and make it more user friendly, so it can be not only something great for our institutional investors, but great for all stakeholders and even for potential employees to look at.
In the SASB framework, what's good about it too is, to Jen's point, there's indicators that they expect to help you normalize. So if you're comparing two different companies, obviously they're going to have different financials. They're going to look a little bit different. So there's indicators as well that help you as an investor kind of normalize and compare. And so that's another reason why the rigor that was kind of been put into that standard to really speak to the expectations of investors, those that are reading this information, that really are looking for what are the material issues by sector that impact enterprise value, that allows for them to kind of utilize that in a way that then informs, their decision making on how, different companies are performing on certain indicators. So, Betty, I think, in particular, as we're thinking about how dynamic this process is, and so regardless of where you're at in your journey, right? Lennox has been at this for a few years. You might be starting, or other companies might be starting out on this. When you kind of went through the process of identifying what the material issues that you guys want to focus on, what was kind of a next step in terms of how you brought different stakeholders, internal stakeholders along, and what roles have you seen kind of developed at Lennox to not just kind of set a strategy, but then implement it over time?
Well, it was very, this was something that came down from our CEO. We've got to get up to speed on ESG, starting with low-hanging fruit and telling our story, because we've always done great things, but we're not out there. So one of the first things we did was form a committee of leaders across the company to help them understand what we were doing and why it mattered. We would have, not an overabundance of meetings, but just so it would be on people's radar. We had interviews with various stakeholders. So our head of technology, our head of IT, our head of HR, and some of their direct reports to talk to them about the things that were important in the SASB and TCFD disclosures, and we would include with that in our interviews with them what our peers were doing, so they could see where other people were and maybe raise the question of, should we go there? Should we talk about this? So it was really great conversations. We set up in addition to our committee, we set up another little subcommittee to keep the executive staff and the CEO apprised of what we were doing. And of course, regularly checked in with George and a consultant that we used that helped us really, be efficient in this. But the results of our interviews with the various leaders in the company really helped us, have a nice outline for our narrative. And then just based on, talking to these people here and these people here, I mean, we knew other people to go talk to about, regulation on refrigerant, we're in a highly regulated area. So what's going on there? Do we have any recycle programs for our equipment? Because the bulk of our equipment is sheet metal, and that's easily recyclable, but are we capturing that? So what's our life cycle story? It's a lot of topics that we addressed, but it's really important to have some kind of framework and to get the people in the company on the same ship, because the ESG things have to start in the businesses. It can't really be a top down. It was top down on education, but it has to be incorporated into what the business does, both from the environmental area, the social area, the product life cycle, and the manufacturing area.
Betty, I'm just curious on that comment. Do you have a sense of how much work was already happening that you were with this framework? It just allowed for you all to kind of pull that together into a central process versus, I know it's probably hard to say like 30 to 70%, but did you get a sense in that process that a lot of the activity was already occurring and it was putting this framework around it allowed for you all to, measure it more effectively and then figure out where the improvements were necessary?
Yeah, I think for most of it, I think for 70%, it was what you said, things were already happening. I mean, we're very apprised of what's going on in the regulatory area. We knew that products were going to change in 2025, for example, with a new refrigerant. So those, engineering was already geared up to revamp our products. So ESG didn't change that. On the environmental side, we'd always had, almost state-of-the-art environmental disclosure. We'd already been disclosing our greenhouse gas emissions and having that audited by an independent third party. So we were well along the road there. Things we didn't have done is we didn't have anything in place to audit where we were capturing the information. When we started this, we developed a database and it's certainly evolved. But just so everything would be in one place so people could see, well, that's why we reported this. The first year, this is a foot fault. The first year we went to HR with respect to some diversity numbers and progress. It might not have been diversity, but something in HR. And we went back the next year and we said, well, last year you said this. Well, the people had changed jobs, had changed positions, and that the original person had left the company and no one could recreate their work. So that was a clue that, maybe an accountant would have known, but as a lawyer, I didn't think about that, she had never documented the process. So we really implemented that. And I think that benchmarking your peers helped move conversations in areas outside of environment and product development. I think that benchmarking the peers helped move the conversation in other places in the company, like product life cycle. Did we take into account how we're going to get a recycling program into place? HR targets. Some of our peers have much greater HR targets as far as gender diversity in leadership. So those two things combined really helped us move along.
Jen, just in this kind of process of working with companies, where do you typically come in contact or work?
Sure. Yeah, Ryan, you want to go ahead to the next slide? So, Betty and Kelly have both mentioned this isn't owned by one function, right? The directive may come from up top, the CEO or the board, but there's a lot of different internal constituents at the company that are going to be dealing with this. And the overlay on all of that from a legal perspective is, as Betty mentioned, yeah, you've got to know what regulations are applicable to your company. But we've mentioned a number of times too, thinking about what are you doing already? What are you doing already? And how can you put that out in your disclosure or talk about it with your stakeholders? So external legal comes into play to help you not just understand what are the current regulations, what are upcoming potential regulations, but also help you keep your finger on the pulse of like, what shouldn't I be saying right now? There's also all this talk about greenwashing, pinkwashing, all these different things where there are companies saying things about their ESG programs that maybe aren't necessarily as true as what's actually going on, right? Actions speak louder than words. So legal helps you, external legal helps you not just to understand what's coming, but taking a look at what you're saying to stakeholders, benchmarking that against what we are seeing with other clients. And also what we're seeing with regulators, where are regulators looking at enforcement actions against what your disclosure is, or where potential private litigation, where potential private litigation coming out. So it really is a collaboration. It's a collaboration with consultants and with people like Killian who understand some of these frameworks and can help work hand in hand in that way. I would say too, understanding things, some of the risks related, that's where legal comes in. And when we think about ESG related risks, I like to say it's kind of akin to the financial fraud sort of risks, where you've got issues that are important to a company and they're important to investors. I need to think about how to manage those, and the board has to be involved in those conversations. And again, it's bigger than climate, right? There's things like cybersecurity that would even fall within the social aspect, I would say, right? So cybersecurity, data privacy, that's something that you need to be knowledgeable about. What are the legal risks? What are the disclosures that you have to come up with? Political lobbying, contributions, all of those are on the governance aspect of things too. So yes, there's a lot to handle, but again, not all of this will be applicable to your company, and a lot of it's probably happening already. But what's important, and I get this question a lot, and I'm sure you do too, Killian, is what if I haven't started? Right? Where do I go? Like, what do I do? The benchmarking comment from Betty, I thought was great. Start looking at what your peers are doing. Start talking internally to see what data we already have. And you can go from there.
Right. Betty, I'm curious from you all in terms of, do you continue to look at the same peers? Do you guys look at other people? What have you kind of learned in that? And is it, because it is somewhat of a competitive differentiation, but also there's opportunities, and they can be challenges as well, to align or engage with peers. How have you guys tried to figure out how to navigate that dynamic where you want to emulate what you do, what they're doing, but you also maybe want to try and figure out ways to differentiate, your approach from theirs?
Yeah, so we certainly continue to look at peers, not only peers in the HVAC industry, but also peers that are manufacturing companies in our geographical headquarter area. So around the DFW area, just to see what they're doing, primarily with respect to the human resources area. But then we also look at, companies that are completely outside of our completely out, not manufacturing companies, but that have great ESG reputations, to see if there are some things that maybe we haven't thought of. Lennox doesn't need to be the same as our peers. Our peers are Trane, Johnson Controls, and Carrier. We don't need to be them. And their story doesn't necessarily have to be our story. We in fact, in some ways, we haven't copied what they do or followed what they do, and we don't have any plans to. We have our own story. But I think that it's good to know what other people are doing, just in case there's a topic that, well, maybe I haven't thought of it that way. Maybe there's something that I could look at this, in a different way. You may look at a company and you may say that you may see that they've started their own ESG committee. A lot of companies did. They purposely added a committee to their board. We didn't do that. But what we did is we have a table that we've disclosed that shows every single ESG type topic and where it falls. Does it fall to the whole board? Does it fall to the audit committee? Blah, blah, blah. And how often it's addressed. So that gives people a good idea of, yes, we're addressing this, and this is the visibility it's seen.
Betty, so the role of the board, they obviously play a key role. What has that experience been with you all in terms of, maybe take us back to 2019 when you were starting this to last year? What's been different with that engagement? Like the effort, I'm sure it's kind of managing up, and then I'm sure there's also guidance that you get down. Just talk us a little bit through what your experience has been like there.
Well, they were very excited. It's clear looking back that they know a lot more now than they did then. not only from, presentations that we've done in-house, but one of them has taken a course through The Economist on greenhouse gas emissions. And a couple others have taken another course, long courses, not just like a webinar, but multiple week-long courses. So they have a lot more knowledge than they did in 2019. One of our board members has been involved with the Nature Conservancy forever, so he was very keen on many environmental things. And it really shows, the hunger for learning that many of our board members have, which, I mean, that means that's a good board member.
Yeah, was that an intentional, that the board members kind of gain those skills? Did you all feel like it was something that was necessary for the board, or was it more voluntary? I think similarly, Jen, I'd be curious what you're hearing from clients in terms of, did they see that skill set as something that they need to either add to the board or increase their board's capability and understanding of it?
Betty, go ahead. I'll give you my input on what I'm hearing, but.
Well, it was completely voluntary on their part. I would say that originally, and I don't know what I would feel right now, but originally we felt like it was our job to educate them on what was important for Lennox and why. I think it's great, though, that they've done this self-education, because it just, they are, the conversation's more engaging, and I think they really enjoy it.
So we get the question a lot too, and Betty mentioned this about, should I have a separate committee? Or should ESG sit with just one committee? And I think the answer there is, it depends on the company, and it depends on who on your board really wants to take this on because they feel that they're curious about it, or they feel passionate about, one part of ESG or all of it. And that's typically what we see happening, is that the board members, they're invested in the company. They understand the critical importance of these factors to the company, and they become the ones who move it forward because they are curious. And oftentimes it does then sit not just within one committee, but it sits across various committees. And you can imagine how that happens with audit. There's going to be, what's the impact on the financials, and how am I going to discuss things with my internal audit function on measuring some of these metrics, and nominating or corporate governance. You may be dealing with, hey, maybe we do have some gaps on the board. Should we look at bringing in a new board member? And that goes hand in hand with other topics too, where you may need to supplement on the board, where maybe you can learn it through director education, but maybe there's directors that you want to bring on that have specific expertise in ESG or in one of those areas. Cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
That there's the new NASDAQ rule, not so new anymore, but listed companies have to have a diverse board, or say why you don't. So there are companies that are looking to bring in diverse candidates. So, but I found that, once a company starts asking these questions and starts having these discussions with the board, people come forward and they say, I want to do this, or I want to learn more about it. And that's the nice thing about having a board that's really involved, is that you've probably got somebody there already who's going to move it forward.
Mm-hmm.
Betty, last week we were talking a little bit about the role of audit. And obviously, as we look forward to a world, maybe in 2024, maybe 2025, maybe 2026, whenever the SEC rule finally is upon us and it starts rolling into financial statements, how are you all, do you feel like you guys are on that path to get to a point in which the audit committee will be ready to oversee and have that be implemented the extent to which you need it to be?
Yeah, we are on a pathway. So, kind of partly because of the experience that we had with the non-repeatable diversity numbers, because the information wasn't documented. Last year, our internal audit group devoted, I think, 400 hours to us to help us to make sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted and documentation was in place for all of the things that we disclosed in our ESG report. And this year they're devoting, I think, 1,200 hours to ensure that that we're having good documentation. And that's a big effort for internal audit. I mean, I don't know that I'm sure they've had to add people, or maybe they're using contract people. I can't remember, but that's going to be it's a great development for us. And it's something that I don't think, depending on what your background is, I don't think it's something that you generally think about, that, well, we've got to document this and document it. But I think that we're in really good shape.
1,200 hours. That seems like a lot.
That is a lot. I think this is a good time to talk a little bit about why. I mean, obviously, with Lennox being a public company, they're all over the regulations and what is coming. And we don't need to get into the details of the proposed climate change rule. It's extensive, and we don't know what will be adopted by the SEC eventually. But what do you say to private companies when they say, well, I'm not going to be subject to these regulations from the SEC because I don't intend on going public? Why should it matter to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, that first slide that we put up there talks about the different stakeholders. And so, you know, in a private company, obviously, your investors are going to be very different, right? They might be heavily concentrated, and obviously you're not dealing with public markets, and so also the regulatory environment is different. But what we have seen is, particularly as the SEC rule has kind of been, SEC's been permanently pregnant with that rule, and then investors have kind of are working towards kind of aligning their expectations. It's the sense of like what the SEC is going to do. Large public companies are still pushing forward with their own strategies around climate, and that trickles down into, particularly if you're a value chain customer for that company. So a lot of companies, or a lot of clients that we talk to, you know, their customers are asking for this information. And so maybe 2 years ago for them, it was, okay, we need to get up to speed with what our investors are asking. Well, now, you know, large public companies, the largest public companies in the world, they're making their own voluntary commitments around certain ESG issues that are encompassing of their value chain. So now you're also in an environment for a lot of companies in which they're having to disclose information, even if it's not publicly disclosed in kind of the public domain, so to speak, but to their customers, because their customers are interested in having that information because the commitments that they're making kind of relate to that. So there's an added dynamic there that you know, they can be challenging, particularly if you're heavily concentrated in a sector and, you know, one of your customers represents a significant amount of your revenue, and you know that your competitors are doing it as well. You potentially are going to be driven to increase your management of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing private companies talk about this since before the SEC proposed the rule, and the questions that they're getting from companies in their value chain. And a lot of it is around the greenhouse gas protocol. Mm-hmm. A lot of large companies, public or private, have already said we intend to go net zero by 2050, or, you know, we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the terminology, there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3.
The next page.
Yeah, next slide, please. So scope 1 is really, you know, a company's direct greenhouse gas emissions. What do you produce yourself in greenhouse gases, right? So for a technology company, that's not going to be much. So scope 1 is, what do you as a company produce? Scope 2 is a little more indirect. It's, you know, what do you produce through purchasing electricity or other sorts of utilities? What are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that? Scope 3, I like to say, is kind of everything else within your supply chain. So looking up and down the supply chain. So scope 3 is, you know, everything from, if I'm a manufacturing company, how are my materials mined? What emissions are produced from that? When the materials get trucked to my manufacturing facility, what are the truck's emissions? And when my employees commute, what are the commuting greenhouse gas emissions. Everything all the way to the other side to your customers and delivering things to stores and the end of life of your product. And are things recycled? Are they thrown in the landfill? So it's literally everything else in your value chain. So when you look at it from that perspective, the greenhouse gas protocol has been around for quite a long time. And companies have been talking about reducing their emissions for a long time as well. So a lot of private companies have already been asked and are being asked because they're within that value chain. What are your emissions? What are your metrics? You need to produce those to me because I'm paying you, right? You're my client. I'm paying you for your product. So companies have to be able to manage this somehow. They have to be able to compete, because what will happen then is if you're not getting the information that you need from your supplier, they might go somewhere else. So that's one of the ways I like to try to explain it to companies, that yes, you may not be subject directly to the SEC's regulation, but you will be subject indirectly. Even if that regulation is never adopted, companies are still adopting these protocols and these frameworks, and they will still be asking for that information.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about Scope 3 in a second with the SEC rule, because of the incongruent maybe component to it. But Betty, I'm curious, you all in your journey, based on the products that you guys create and sell, there's emissions that are coming on both sides, right? From how you're procuring the actual materials that you need to how they're being used. How have you all approached managing Scope 3? And in addition to that, I'd just be really curious to hear even reflections from when it came up for the first time, what leadership's point of view was on, how are we going to do this, to maybe, where you're all at now and try to approach it.
Well, as I mentioned before, we had been looking at our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for a while with a third party. So that was really an advantage for us. I think the biggest takeaway for management was when we show if we illustrate on a chart the amount of scope 1 emissions that we produce in a year, scope 2, which is smaller than scope 1, but scope 3 is almost 1,000 times larger than either of them, because our scope 3 primarily, over 96% of it is from customers using our product. So it's the natural gas that fires your furnace. It's the coal that's making the electricity for your air conditioner to run. So that is where our scope 3 comes from. One of the big developments recently has been being able to switch from furnaces to heat pumps. Heat pumps have been around for a long time. It's essentially something that on the outside looks like your outdoor air conditioner, but it switches from being an air conditioner to a heater, depending on the season. A heat pump is a kind of a stupid misnomer. They should, if they were marketers, they would have thought of something else, because it sounds like something that pumps heat. And those run on electricity. So the more that HVAC manufacturers can move people from furnaces to heat pumps, the scope 3 emissions will go way down, because the biggest chunk of scope 3 comes from natural gas, using natural gas. And I'm happy to say that Lennox was the first manufacturer to win the cold climate heat pump challenge. The development now is getting heat pumps that can be used in cold climates, because they used to really only be for mild climates like where I am in Texas. But that conversation, we have a new CEO that started a year ago in May, and he talks about heat pumps frequently when he talks to the press, because that's something that's really going to change the footprint for all of the HVAC manufacturers.
So it's very much for you all, this is kind of built into your product strategy in a way, or it's increasingly becoming an opportunity from a standpoint of how Lennox is positioned in the market and the market shift that's happening around.
Exactly. And I would say it's increasing the opportunity, like you said, like the way you put it there. It really is. And we've been, of course, working on heat pumps for a while, but certainly doubling down more than we probably would have had this not been an issue. Because we have, similar to what you guys have talked about, customers that have taken on gigaton challenges. Walmart is a customer. Other big companies that are customers that want to know what our greenhouse gas emissions are.
And Betty, understanding that what 97% of your emissions come from scope 3, how did you go about calculating that? For those that maybe are, not as familiar with the process, like how do you actually try to assign a amount of emissions that are coming from your scope 3?
Well, it's very complicated. But we worked with our engineers for the product. I mean, we look at the life cycle of the product. We look at the zip codes where we're selling the product. We don't sell products directly to consumers. We sell the majority of our products. Some are sold to distributors, but the majority of our products are sold to dealers, independent dealers. So we know where the dealers are located, and we know what if the electricity grid is clean or dirty, whether, meaning is the electricity grid powered by hydroelectric power, which is clean, or coal power, which is dirty. And then we take into account the hours that the units are generally running, the lifetime, and the grid. And the EPA puts out a grid that you can look at. I didn't actually do this work, so that's why the hand waving. But by zip code on how clean the electricity is. So all of us in the world, we haven't set a net zero goal, but I would guess that most people that have set net zero goals, if they do have significant scope 3, they're all betting on the electricity grid getting cleaner.
I feel like we're walking through various aspects of the SEC proposed rule, which just shows you how it's all intertwined, and it's not just the rule itself. I mean, we're talking about things like, how do you measure your scope 3 emissions, and some of the criticism around the SEC rule and it requiring companies to disclose their scope 3 emissions. I mean, a few of the main issues that have come out of that are the SEC has proposed that companies must disclose their scope 3 emissions if the scope 3 emissions are material to the company. Well, first of all, how do you know unless you go and you measure it? So then you've already got the metrics. But then when you think about scope 3 and how all encompassing it is, I bet that there are a lot of companies in Lennox's situation where scope 3 is going to outweigh scope 1 and scope 2. And go ahead.
It's expensive, right? It's not something you just do on the back of an envelope.
It's expensive. And that brings me to the next criticism that I've heard about the SEC's proposed rule is that it's expensive to even measure. And then how do we know that it's comparable? How can we trust the data that we're getting? How accurate is it really? And then how are we supposed to be able to compare that across companies? If you're using different third-party sources to measure it, there's nothing that's really standardized about it. So it makes it a lot more difficult when you are requiring scope 3 disclosure and saying that we're only doing this because we want investors and others to be able to compare it across companies.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, not being a lawyer, but it almost runs counter to a lot of legal frameworks and strategies. It's like you need to assign specific responsibility for your contribution to this. And in reality, scope 3 is intentionally gray. It's intentionally overlap. It's intended to try and drive a conversation around, okay, we're all contributing to this collective problem. Well, then how do you kind of take those two concepts and mush them together in a way that then is going to be something that's understandable, that's broadly interpreted in the same direction and way? It's a real challenge.
Yep.
We have a little bit of time left. I wonder if there's any questions, but as we go to that, I'm just curious, we started this conversation talking about the dynamism around ESG, the changing environment. There's a lot of things that have shifted even in 12 months,
Definitely.
Right? And if you take back 24 months, a lot has shifted from there. So I'm just curious to put you both on the spot, and I'll as well. As we look forward to the next 12 or 24 months, what comes to your minds when you think about what might shift and what companies should be thinking about in terms of this dynamic environment that they're operating within when it comes to ESG?
I mean, the first thing I always say is it's not going away. And I think that it's gotten a lot more attention. ESG in general has gotten a lot more attention in the past 3 years because there have been a lot of the factors I talked about in the beginning that have all sort of come together. But even without some of those factors, without some of the social unrest, without some of the mistrust in government, this was still building over time. And you see that when you look at the frameworks and the standards, those have been building over time because that's what investors have been asking for. They've been asking for more of this information. So it's not going away. We may be in a bit of a pause or a stall right now because the SEC is going to have some challenges. There's a lot of anti-ESG blowback that we're seeing that we've seen with public companies, shareholder proposals, anti-ESG proposals, which we didn't see up until last year, I want to say.
Yeah, not at the percentage, yeah.
Yeah, anti-ESG legislation in various states and things that, seemed like it was a little more clear a few years ago, it's stalled now. And there are reputational issues with complying and not complying because of those issues. But still, I don't think this is going away. And it's important for companies to think about how they're going to manage all of these stakeholders' expectations going forward. And if you haven't started, that's okay. But you need to be identifying who's going to lead the charge, who wants to be involved, and start thinking about how to, and Betty brought this up, which was great, how can I use this as an opportunity? Right? What am I good at? And how can I remain competitive? And what are the aspects of this that I can use to benefit the company?
You bring up a really good, interesting point too, which there's a distinction, while they're related, they're not the exact same thing, between having a strategy and approach and disclosing information.
Yes.
And sometimes I feel the way that we typically look at it is, what is a company disclosing? It doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't thinking about it and they haven't built a program and strategy around how they're going to manage it. They've just made the appropriate discernment on what is the information that makes sense to disclose, as opposed to what is the issues that we want to track and build a strategy for, so that we have it integrated into our risk management program, or that we have it so it's communicated up to the board so they have the foresight and understanding of the approach that we're taking.
Yep. But be careful about what you disclose too.
Yes.
Right? I have to say that as a lawyer. Right?
Yes,
be careful
of course.
about what you say.
Yeah. And to your point, as these things become part of regulatory requirements, there's more of that ratcheting up of that expectation. You need your outside counsel to take a look at it. A lot of times we give that advice to clients all the time. We'll say, what about this information? We go, like, you need to run that by your lawyer. We can give you our guidance on what we think is the appropriate way to frame this, but you're getting into this environment where you need multiple different people, either internal or external, to be involved in understanding how to approach these issues. Betty, what do you?
Well, and your outside counsel can give you ideas as well. Their outside counsel is not just to check to make sure you're staying in the lane, but they've seen a lot of things. So someone like Jen has seen a lot of different companies, proxies coming through. She has a lot of ideas in addition to making sure you're doing the right thing.
Betty, what are you thinking about over the next 12, 24 months?
Well, I live in Texas. So, we're just right there with the Florida. But I think that I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I think it may be called something different. It may not be called ESG. Maybe they may come up with another name, but the cat's out of the bag, right? I mean, most people believe that there's climate change. Most people want to work for a company that does good things. That helps people that are disadvantaged, that brings everybody along, that educates its workforce, that doesn't, that's fair and equitable, that gives back to the community, that has a well-run board. People want to be associated. All the things that ESG is, people want to be associated with those values. So I don't think it's going away. I think it may be called something different, particularly if the presidential election goes to another party, but it's not going away. These are the values that people want in companies that they invest in and that they work for, because these are the values that make a company sustainable.
Betty, you brought up, the acronym may be fading. And I think for me, that's one of the things that we're looking at over the next few years. It's not so much, we never, even though ESG is in my title, we never put a lot of weight on the acronym itself. It's more of a helpful organizing framework. And so what we've seen going into this season is a number of the institutional managers have revised their guidelines to actually take ESG out of the guidelines, the stewardship guidelines. Not because they're walking back their commitments, but they're putting more specific and precise language in. So they've added language like biodiversity, human capital management, these things that actually speak to the kind of enterprise value drivers that they feel like certain industries should be focused on based on what those industries are. They also revise their guidelines to put the emphasis more on the board and directors to manage those material risk issues, and kind of taking a pause, to your point, on saying we're going to be less prescriptive and direct, and we're going to be less transparent. So that does open up another element for companies to consider. Yes, stewardship teams and asset managers, we're really driving a lot of the conversation around ESG, but they're also being transparent about their priorities. If you have less transparency, there's a gap, and you have to kind of account for, okay, we don't necessarily know how they're going to evaluate and make decisions as to whether or not we're managing things appropriately. So it does shift that dynamic. And I think that's something we're going to see, not a de-emphasis, but lack of clarity maybe over the next few years from institutions on what they think their priorities are. And then, depending on the company, we're seeing regulations move really quickly in the EU and in Europe. And so if you have a footprint outside of the US, or you have big customers that have a footprint outside of the US, there's going to be a myriad of other drivers that you have to contend with that maybe, you're not currently aware of or paying attention to.
Yeah. Glad you brought that up. That's a really good point. Yeah. This isn't just a US issue. And in fact, other countries are the regulatory scheme than we are. Yeah. Okay. I think we are done with our time, but if there's any questions, we're happy to take them. Nothing online.
Nothing online.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you. Bye-bye.